Now, welcome to another Let's Talk Some Star Wars. That was actually more of a Let's Talk Some Marvel or superhero movies, because the question this time is, do you have a case of superhero fatigue? And of course, I will also be reading and responding to some of the comments left on this poll, but before we do that, we have to get to the results, where we will see that 18% of people said, yes, I'm so sick of superhero movies. 43% then said, not a full-blown case, but I don't watch care like I used to. 3% then said, no, not at all, I want more and more of them. And then 36% said, just a case of bad superhero movie fatigue. Alright, and I think there are a few interesting things we can take away just from these numbers, beginning with the fact that 43% of people, which is almost half, but not quite, but we'll say almost half of the people who voted, and there were 12,000 who did, and mind you, yes, I am a Star Wars channel, but I think there is a ton of overlap between, say, Star Wars and comic book movies, so pretty much the same fan base. But 43% of people, nearly half, said they're not as interested as they once were, and that should be a very alarming number when you think about it. When nearly half of your customers are saying, yeah, your stuff is okay, I'm not like totally sick of it, but I just don't care or watch like I used to. And even more alarming should be the fact that only 3% of people said they do still care like they used to, are still all in on this and just want more and more of what they've been getting. That's a really small number. And then, of course, you also have 18%, nearly 1 out of every 5, who responded, who said they're just sick of superhero movies altogether. It doesn't have anything to do with them being bad, which is where the other 36% fall into the I just don't like bad superhero movies, and that's the problem here. But again, almost 1 out of every 5 people who responded said they're just kind of sick and tired of superhero movies. And then you have almost half who said they just don't care like they used to. And again, only 3% who are like, yeah, keep it going. So again, pretty alarming numbers, I would say, for Marvel or the new DC universe, which just kicked off with Superman. Now, I'm not saying I think the new DC universe is dead on arrival, but I think it is arriving at perhaps the worst possible time it could. Maybe it'll produce some really good movies and it'll be just fine, but something tells me that the age of superhero movies is not coming to an end entirely, but it is certainly not what it was throughout the 2010s, shall we say. Okay, and now we will move on to some comments, but not before once again just taking a moment to say thank you to everybody who votes or comments or watches these or any of my videos across both the channels, and a huge, huge thank you to those who support the channels over on Patreon, and again, make my Discord server the best place on the internet to talk some Star Wars, and other things as well. Alright, and now on to that top-rated comment, which we always kick things off with, and this time it comes to us from Nicholas Christensen, who said, I have a bad movie fatigue. And I think this obviously implies you're not just tired, and the people who agreed with you, because again, this is the top-rated comment. It got the most thumbs up of any comment on the poll. But you and others feel like movies in general have just gotten worse and worse, that we are living in an age of bad movies in general, and maybe that's because we live in an age of superhero movies and redoing old films and taking things that were once animation and turning them into live action, and we're doing sequels and we're trying to reboot everything, and everything else is based off something well known like video games or maybe a famous book or whatever it might be, a previous television series, whatever it might be. Nothing is original anymore, and that is tiring, that everything you go and see is something you have kind of seen before. I mean, somehow the seventh, yes, seventh Jurassic Park movie just came out. And though I love the first one, and some of the other ones have been okay, I don't know that this was a series or franchise that needed to go 7 movies deep. In fact, even though I loved the first one when I was young, and that was, I think, the first movie I ever seen in the theater multiple times, but I didn't even bother to go see the new one in the theater. I will probably catch it on streaming, but I'm not super excited for it. Anyway, I do agree that the movie industry has a problem, and that problem is the death of originality. Everything is something you have seen before in some way, shape, or form, and all too often the new iteration is worse than previous ones. Alright, and on to the next comment now, and this one comes to us from Phantom Immortal, who said, a big issue is that there's just too much. Everything. And this was starting to happen even back in Phase 3, when they cranked out 3 to 4 movies annually. I was able to keep up back then because it was building to Endgame pretty quickly, whereas starting in 2021, the ask was keep up with all of our shows and movies, 6+ annually, for a payoff that might happen, but maybe not, who knows. which is a non-starter coming off the nice tie-up that was Endgame and Spider-Man Far From Home and No Way Home, which I think of as an epilogue to the OG MCU. And I agree with this 100%. There is a lot to try to keep up with, and the problem is it keeps compounding. Now, you don't necessarily have to go back and watch all of the first three phases to understand what's going on now in the MCU, if anything has been going on lately, which you point out in your comment here. But you do have this problem of if I don't watch everything, then I do feel like I'm missing something and I'm not getting the fullest out of it that I should. So at some point, you're just like, well, maybe I should just stop watching if I'm not getting the fullest and I don't have the time to put into all of it. And so what I personally think has happened is that the thing that once upon a time made the MCU special, the fact that yes, all of these movies were connected, we were building to Endgame, and as you point out in the comment here, doing it fairly quickly and concisely. Yes, it was like 10 years, but it was done very well in that 10-year period, not like the last few years where, again, as you say, it's just kind of like, here's a new movie and show that might have relevancy later on. It might not. You'll just have to wait and see. Maybe that post-credit scene will be important later on. Maybe it will be completely forgotten. But anyway, I think the idea that made the MCU something special in the first place, not that they created the idea, you can actually go to comic books, regular comic books, and you can see that they were the ones who were doing crossovers and team-ups and that sort of thing well before the movies decided to mimic it. But I think the idea that you could have a series of movies coming out that are sort of independent and sort of connected and that they build to something bigger, I think that was an amazingly brilliant idea, and the fact that more often than not, the movies were actually good, I think that led to one of the greatest achievements in the history of film, maybe the greatest achievement you could argue, that being the first three phases culminating with Infinity War and Endgame. And then afterwards, the idea with trying to continue to keep up with everything as they again move to Disney Plus and so on, I think it got exhausting for a lot of people. One question I get asked all the time as someone who has kept up with Marvel and Star Wars, I get people who ask me about one of those two franchises, or any of the franchises really. They will ask me, do I need to see this movie, or do I need to see that show? And that, I think, is a problem because it starts to feel like there's some sort of obligation or necessity for you to see everything in order to keep up, or you become lost. And like I was saying before, once you are lost, you have to ask yourself, do I try to find my way and catch up and understand what's going on, or do I just say the hell with it and move on to something else in my life? And I think given the quality of the movies lately and the fact that no, there hasn't been much of an overarching story, I think a lot of people have said, screw it, I'm just going to move on from the MCU. Endgame was just that. It was the end of the MCU. Okay, and now we move on to this comment from Valon, who said, it's lore fatigue. Watching Endgame felt like I was taking some sort of final exam. The idea that I needed to keep track of even more stuff is what made me jump off the Marvel train. And that was just the movies. They were throwing shows at us too. I have a decent amount of free time and I'm told I'm a smart guy, but I can only take so much. And this comment kind of goes along with what I was just saying, but there's another interesting aspect that I've noticed with some people who didn't necessarily catch the Marvel train the first time around, or never really got into the MCU back in, say, the late 2000s or early 2010s, when it was really starting to take off. I've had a few people ask me, how do I get into watching the MCU? Because in my circle of friends and family, I am obviously known as the Star Wars and comic book guy. So they'll come to me and be like, how do I even begin to watch all this? And that's a tricky question, isn't it? Because it's one thing when you did get on board in 2008 with Iron Man or Incredible Hulk or whatever it might have been, and you just followed along as it went. But now that's almost 40 movies ago. I think there are 37 Marvel MCU movies, if I'm right, and then a half dozen series or more at this point. And though, sure, for some people, they're going to go back and start that journey and they're going to love it because they don't have to wait in between movies or shows and they can just go right through it. For a lot of people, when you tell them that, that's a very daunting number. That is a very daunting task. And even when you're like, well, you don't necessarily have to watch these, or you can kind of start here and maybe catch up. But it's again kind of funny how I think the thing that sold the MCU, that made it phenomenal, is kind of become the thing that might unravel it, which is why we've heard that after Secret Wars, they're going to relaunch the universe, but I think that isn't going to solve the problem. I think when you do that, even more people are going to say, you know what, I'm not going along for the ride this time. I'm good, I'm done, I loved what you did in those first three phases, Maybe Secret Wars will be fantastic and it'll be an even better cap off than Endgame. But I think you're in a damned if you do, damned if you don't double-edged sword kind of conundrum with the MCU right now. Because I think if you keep it going, you're going to have people that just continue to jump off because they just don't want to follow it anymore. And if you restart it, the people are going to say, thank you for finally giving me a jumping off point. I don't have to keep following it because I have been following it for 20 years or whatever. So thank you for finally saying, this is it, and I don't really want to get into the next one. All right, and now we move on to this one from Aaron Conway, who said, a superhero film is more like a setting similar to Star Wars, where you can have a superhero thriller like The Winter Soldier, a superhero comedy like Guardians of the Galaxy, or just a straight up R-rated superhero action like Deadpool. As long as the story is well written, the performances are great, and the general production is given some care, then I'll always enjoy a superhero film. And I agree with this. As long as you make a good movie, superhero or not, really, I'll want to see it. I mean, I don't think the age of superheroes needs to necessarily completely die. I just think that the age of making too many of them needs to end. And maybe, despite the fact that, yes, I did enjoy the ride, maybe the MCU needs to just end and just focus on making good character stories. One single character or one team, one story, not a part of something bigger, not sitting around waiting for the post-credit scene so you can get a clue as to what's next. Maybe just making good movies again is the key. Don't worry so much about the bigger picture. Make something good in the here and now that people are going to go into a theater and enjoy for 2 hours without thinking about, oh, what's next or what came before. All right, and we are going to finish it off with this comment now from Emmanuel Silvera, who said, if you love comics and superheroes, how could you possibly have superhero fatigue? And I think I know what you're saying, and I do kind of agree. It's like with me and Star Wars. I don't have Star Wars fatigue. I've been following it since my earliest memories, literally. I don't think I'm ever going to get tired of the idea of Star Wars. Even if current day Star Wars is bad and continues to be bad and gets worse or goes away, I can still go back and play my favorite games or watch the original movies or the prequels or Rogue One or Andor or any of the stuff that I really enjoyed. I'm always rooting for Star Wars to be good. I hope the next slew of movies is phenomenal and everybody loves Star Wars again and everything that's been happening in the last decade is forgotten. That's my hope, and I'm never going to get tired of Star Wars. But I am tired already of bad Star Wars, just like I'm tired of bad superhero movies. However, when and if they're good, I'm going to continue to enjoy them. That's the thing. I just want good movies. And I agree, I don't think it is necessarily a superhero fatigue problem. I think it is a bad movie fatigue problem. I do think, yes, to a degree, we've had too many superhero movies. We could pump the brakes a little bit, maybe produce a few less of them. But overall, I do think it simply comes down to how good the movie actually is. All right, well, I think that is going to be all I got for you this time. Now it is your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you think. Do you have superhero fatigue or do you have bad movie fatigue? Or maybe you're someone who says, I can't get enough superhero movies, keep them coming. Whatever the case may be, leave a comment below. Let's talk some superheroes. And until next time, thanks for watching.